Buenas tardes. Les agradecemos mucho estar con nosotros hoy en la tarde. Estaremos hablando de un tema muy importante, que es cómo evaluar o valorizar el ciberriesgo. Esta es una herramienta fenomenal que nos va a ayudar a tomar muy buenas decisiones y poder llegar a la junta directiva y a la alta gerencia y hablar el mismo idioma que ellos. Estamos atravesando unos problemas técnicos. Les voy a pedir 10 minutos. Nos vamos a retirar 10 minutos. Tenemos unos problemas de conexión con nuestro panelista. En 10 minutos estaremos de vuelta. Los vemos aquí a las 43. Muchas gracias y los veo un ratito. Gracias. Volvimos, ya están resueltos, esperamos, los problemas técnicos. Como todos los que estamos en tecnología sabemos, Murphy es parte del equipo de trabajo y hoy se hizo presente. Vamos a dar el videito corto para aquellos que necesitan pasarse al canal en inglés, en castellano. Lo hagan. Este es un videito de 20 segundos y volvemos y de ahí nos llevamos toda la conversación en inglés. Gracias. Okay, thank you very much for waiting. We're back. I want to introduce and give the welcome to Bob Vesio. Bob Vesio is an old-time friend. We won't make numbers how many years we have been working together with Bob in different companies, but I'll tell you a little bit about him. Bob graduated from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. He has worked in TrueSecure way long time ago as a senior security analyst, in CyberTrust as a cybersecurity programs director, in Verizon Security Solutions as a global director for advanced services, advanced security services. Currently, Bob is the chief analytics officer for SSIC, which means Secure Systems Innovation Corporation. He has a patent for the methodology to model and measure cyber risk. Currently, his model is used to underwrite billions of cyber risk insurance. Maybe we can put Bob in the picture. Hey, Bob, thank you very much. Welcome to our living room. I see you are in a very different weather. It was raining until a couple of minutes ago here, and you are in Phoenix.
That's correct, yes. And no rain. Rain would be nice.
Okay, fantastic, Bob. So tell us, I don't know if I told our audience everything you do currently, because I think it was very, very short. So maybe you could explain a little bit more of what you do day to day in secure systems, and then we go on with the conversation.
Sure, absolutely. So my main responsibility is to continue to innovate and push the understanding of cyber as related to financial risk forward. Our initial model was developed back in 2016. The world has continued to change since then. So I've continued to dig through tons and tons of data. So research is a big part of my job on a daily basis, but really trying to understand how I take that data and tie it into mathematical components so that we can help organizations in both very deep ways as well as very light touch ways understand their financial exposure as related to cyber risk. Most recently, a lot of my time has been spent in the supply chain world. We've been working with organizations directly to figure out how to assess their suppliers. We have many customers, Mauricio, that have well over 700, 800 suppliers. And instead of looking at something like a BitSight score, a FICO cyber score, they really want to understand what that supplier means from a financial standpoint. And so the advancements in our modeling lately have been specifically related to supply chain. But I'll pass it back to you, personally.
Thank you. Yeah, that's surely interesting because in this pandemic world, supply chain is becoming difficult.
Yes.
As you know, most of the questions we receive constantly from CISOs and people in security are related to how can I take the message to my board? How can I convince upper management that there is a risk and this risk is real and it can really impact the company? Because many times when we visit the boardroom and we're invited to do some presentation to the boardroom, it seems like we're speaking the language of the dolphins. They can see our mouths are moving and they hear sounds coming out of our voices, but they cannot understand. And immediately they shut down. And when they shut down their attention, the answer is no. So what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, this is a question, as you can imagine, I've got a lot, especially over the last several years. And part of it has been the World Economic Forum, the National Association of Corporate Directors, which a lot of your board members for the Fortune 2000 organizations, they sit as members of the NACD, work that we're doing through the Internet Security Alliance. This question comes up on a regular basis. In fact, every time we have a quarterly board meeting with the Internet Security Alliance, this is one of the key topics that's talked about. Mauricio, are you familiar with the term acamaracus? Do you know this term?
Acamaracus, no, but maybe you could explain it to us.
So it's actually, in the United States, it's more of slang, but it is a word if you Webster Dictionary out of the United Kingdom, not the United States, but out of the United Kingdom. It's actually a word that is in their Webster Dictionary, but it is a tale of nonsense that's used to mislead or confuse. And when I think about a lot of today's cybersecurity metrics, I think that board members, executives, chief executive officers, from the CFO to the CEO, even to the CRO, the chief risk officer, I think they look at a lot of those cybersecurity metrics as a form of acamaracus. They feel as if they don't really know what they're saying, and it basically comes across as really just a bunch of nonsense, arbitrary values that don't really mean anything as related to the business. And so, you know, how do we get around that? Well, I think first and foremost, if we're not talking about cyber risk in a language that all other risks are discussed in the business, then we're missing an opportunity to reveal the problem, the cyber-related problem, to the executives, to the board of directors, as well as even the mid-level management. If you think about it, every business owner, CEO, is really concerned about three. They're concerned about the revenue that they're generating. And in fact, that goes all the way down to how they motivate their sales teams to ensure that revenue is growing quarter over quarter, year over year. But it also ties into expense control. Are we able to control our expenses in a way that we can maintain a healthy margin for our business to not only keep the executives happy, but to keep shareholders also happy as related to the business? And they don't want to see unexpected surprises related to that expense line that they're reporting on a quarterly basis. So when we think about those two things, think about revenue, think about expenses, everything in cyber, whether it's a data breach or a ransomware event or a business interruption event from a human pushing out buggy code, all of those things need to tie to one of those two things, if not both. If it's a business interruption event, it's directly related to an organization not having the ability to generate revenue. So that could be really bad, and it could be bad on certain days of the year far more significantly than other days of the year. If we think about something like ransomware, not only does ransomware also interfere with the ability to generate revenue because it's holding data or systems hostage, but in addition to that, it's also keeping the organization from an overtime perspective and a resource perspective. It's keeping them very, very busy trying to recover systems. And then there's also the extortion element, and that extortion element, we've seen extortions this year as high as $1 million being paid out. $35 million is something you're definitely going to notice on your expense budget, especially if it's an unexpected surprise on that expense line. When we think about things like data breach doesn't so much interfere with revenue of the business. Yes, you could have customer churn and brand damage. But when we think about data breach is really more significant to an increase on the expense line. You have regulatory fines, you have increased transaction fees if it's multiple PCI related breaches. You know, all of those things create an unhealthy circumstance for an organization. And again, ties back to the two things that they care about, revenue or expenses. There's another one, Mauricio, and that's misappropriation of intellectual property. There's a lot of theft of intellectual property today. We see it all the time. Anybody that looks at dark reading their website, you see at least once a week, you can see that there's a new arrest related to cyber espionage or some form of trade theft or intellectual property theft. And that's not going away. And intellectual property does have a value to an organization. It gives them a market advantage. And if that intellectual property leaves from, say, someplace like Panama or Guatemala and ends up in the hands of an organization that can sell at even half the price that they can sell at, that becomes a very big problem for that very particular organization in terms of generating revenue. So to capture all of this and really sort of summarize all of it, it is very important that we take all of those traditional cybersecurity metrics, things like vulnerability scans, things like measurements against frameworks, ISO, NIST, PCI, whatever it happens to be, and we have the ability to interpret those things into a financial exposure value that helps an organization understand where they have financial loss related to either revenue or related to an increase on the expense line that they're reaping on a quarterly basis. So hopefully, Mauricio, that was able to answer the question.
That was fantastic. Yeah, and absolutely. What we have to do is be able to bring the numbers of the exposure, of the financial exposure in both cases, either reduced revenue or increased expenditure, to the guys that know the numbers. They live by the numbers, yeah. They work by the numbers every day. And when we go to tell them, look, this is a very high risk and it's a red color risk, it doesn't make any sense to them at all. What does that mean? And if we don't express it in dollars and cents so they can figure out how big the exposure is and how, what's the peril that they're exposing their company to, they won't be able to make the correct decisions. And I would assume that in most boards, you don't have people that are experts in cyber risk. That is something quite new, and boards are not used. Very few boards are technically savvy, much less cyber risk savvy. Have you seen any of these happening in really big companies?
So I mentioned the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, and Mauricio, every year when they publish their cyber handbook, I do send it to you. In fact, they even have one that's a Latin American version that I've sent to you in the past. You know, the NACD is trying to educate board members on how to be smarter when it comes to cyber and cyber consequences related to organizations. They're not expecting them by any means to be technical, right? But they are trying to make sure that they understand the basics. They understand what a data breach is, or what a ransomware event is, or theft of intellectual property. They're trying to make sure that they understand that which values are arbitrary, Maracus, to what we were talking about earlier, to values that actually do make sense and resonate. And so the NACD does have online courses for board members that they can take so that they can become educated. There is a push in some organizations to bring on at least one member of the board that has cybersecurity, though I think, Mauricio, to your point, that's still extremely limited and rare. But in a lot of ways, I think the problem doesn't have to be addressed by adding somebody with technical skills to the board. I think the problem can very easily be addressed by changing how we communicate with the board or how we communicate with the executives. Instead of trying to force the executives to speak the technical language that chief information security officers speak, I think it's more important that CISOs change their language to speak the language that board and executive members speak, which across the board, whether it's the head of legal or the head of marketing or the head of human services or the head of financial, all of those members of the board know what financial data sheets look like. And again, if we can just convert all of our metrics to look like financial metrics, speaking the language that they already understand, and it doesn't require separate translation whatsoever.
Yeah, that is correct. And and it's quite trivial once you know the size of the risk and the size of the remediation to make those decisions. And the decisions are quite easy, right? either we mitigate or we evitar. Oh boy, the word in English. I'm forgetting my Spanish and my English at the same time. So this getting transfer is the last one. Yeah, transfer, which is quite new in our country. So until now, we're just starting to get cyber insurance offerings in this region. So these decisions must be financial or business decisions. They should not be technical decisions. And that is one of the things that I usually make fun of us engineers, and please, I'm one of the worst, because I assume that we know more. That is like a thing that all engineers have, that we think we know more. So we start trying to make business decisions where they must be made by the business people, by the owners of the risk. Those are the guys that should be making the decisions. Upper management, the board of directors, and the owners that have mandated either the upper management or the board of directors to make those decisions for them. So the problem is many times the risk decisions are being made by the technical people in IT or in information security, and that should not be. Well, I think we should be able to communicate, as you were talking, how does this risk look from the financial standpoint, so they can make the correct decisions in order to decide, what do you want to do with the risk? Do you want to take it, transfer it, mitigate it, or evadir? The people that are listening in Spanish will get it. Don't you worry, because our audience speaks Spanish. So, evitar o evadir. Okay, anyway, tell us a very, very high level, 30,000 feet. How does your patented methodology calculate the value of cyber risk?
Yeah, so what we're doing with our method is we're capturing all of the basic variables that everybody, when it comes to cyber risk. So we're capturing a threat landscape variable. What does threat look like? And we put a context in related to the industry in which the organization operates, as well as unique things that are related to that organization. We also take in the context the applicability of asset groups. Do they have certain types of asset groups, or did they not have those things? So things like end user systems, servers, web applications, point of sale, healthcare devices, onboard systems like autonomous cars, et cetera. And then we weave in exposure and impact related items. So where do they operate in the world, all the way to what are the type of records that they have, what are their operating hours, what's the volume of records in which they're dealing with within their business. Are we talking 1 million, 10 million, 1 billion, 5 billion? I do have one customer that has over 5 billion records. They're a Fortune 100 company. And then we weave in things like the control profile or the control landscape. And that's an understanding of how well controls are implemented. And we can look at controls related to NIST or ISO or PCI or the CIS top 20 critical security controls. And of course, we're producing things that look like residual risk scores, which of course, everybody understands residual risk, at least from the CISO perspective, because we've been dealing with this concept for almost 2 decades now. But the thing that we do that is absolutely different is we take all of those risk scores and we translate those things into risk indexes, which becomes a term that's used by financial services. They look at a lot of things based on indexes. And once we convert those risk scores into an index, we have the then further mathematically modify the probability of events across multiple loss categories. So we look at data breach as a specific type of an event. We look at business interruption as another type of event. We look at miss of intellectual property as another event. We look at SWIFT banking fraud as another event. We have a variety of events that we look at, and we use those risk indexes to determine whether the probability of that event is going up or down, So the more risky an organization is, then the higher the probability. The less risky an organization is, then the lower probability becomes. What is absolutely critical is that you can't eliminate probability. So no matter what an organization does, there's always going to be some leftover risk, some risk that they have to contend with. Now, Mauricio, one of the things that we do, and it tends to work really well, especially with the executive and the board members, is we take all of that data. There's over 75,000 calculations that make the model, so it's a very complicated model. But in a relatively short period of time, gathering information about an organization, we can tell an organization what their financial exposure looks like on an annual basis. So we can indicate how much loss they should expect to see in data breach, or how much loss they should expect to see in business interruption or ransomware or misappropriation of intellectual property on an annual basis. And what we do with that number is we further take that number and we place it over the organization's annual revenue number. And that gives us another ratio. And that ratio, if it's above 1%, is usually indicative that the organization can't absorb that risk. And they need to start seeking mitigation options and transfer options that you were just talking about a moment ago. If that number between 0.1% all the way to 0.99%, so not quite 1% yet, then that number is indicative that they have some moderate risk from a financial exposure standpoint. They might be able to absorb some of it, but they probably want to still take some additional action to mitigate or transfer that risk, just in case something really bad were to happen, like they had an all-record breach or a massive business interruption on the absolute worst day of the year. And then if that number, that ratio is less than 0.1%, then we indicate that that risk is low. And that is really just indicative of the fact that that is a risk that can very easily be absorbed by the organization. And there's really no reason for them to spend additional money trying to seek cybersecurity improvements, because there's not really that big of a cybersecurity problem. Now, the reason that we always look at that number over revenue, Mauricio, is that by itself, that number can look scary, right? If we show an organization a number that's $38 million of annual loss, that could look like a horrifying number, especially to mid-level management, and then they become intimidated and they don't want to share that to upper management. But when we show that number in proportion to revenue, then all of a sudden it gives you a very different view. If that $38 million is over an organization that's making $10 billion, it's really not that big of a deal. On the other hand, if it's $38 million over a company that's only making $100 million a year, that becomes a very significant number. So we tend to find that those ratios, like all other ratios that are used in financial reporting, tend to put that number in perspective to allow them to make those determinations for risk mitigation, risk acceptance, or risk transfer. One other thing that our model also does, Mauricio, is that we also have loss lookup tables as part of a byproduct related to everything that we do. So if an organization were to experience an event, like let's say they had a 50 million data breach, 50 million record data breach, they could actually go into the loss tables, look to see, just like an actuarial table, they can see what that loss looks like, both from a total impact as well as from an insurable impact. And we tend to find that those loss lookup tables give a lot of really interesting information to executives, especially the chief risk officers of organizations, because that number can allow them to work with their broker in the right context to ensure that they have the right insurance limits related to the type of cyber insurance policy that they're buying. One of the big problems in cyber insurance today is that people are underbuying limits. To put it in a very clear context, it would be like buying insurance for your home, and then your home gets destroyed by a hurricane, and then you come to find out that the insurance that you bought only replaced 10% of your home. You want to be really happy with that insurance purchase because it was way undersold or under capacity. So those loss lookup tables, which is a byproduct of what we do, is actually something that is referenced very frequently by the chief risk officers that interface with our model. But I'll pause here, Mauricio, to see if there's more questions that you want to ask.
Fantastic. So what I understand is that with, well, it's something very complex, and through mathematics and automation made very simple. This ratio of potential loss against the revenue is like a street light, red, yellow, and green. If it's very low, it's green,
Yeah.
keep on business as usual. If it's yellow, do stuff. And if it's red, do stuff really quickly.
Right.
With one little number, you can go to the upper management and say, okay, guys, in these areas of the business, this is how the semaphores or the street light looks like. And it's all red. It's time to start thinking on doing security seriously and buying cyber insurance. If it's yellow, as we have to improve things, and if it's green, we're fine. Let's go for a holiday because we're doing fine. So all this, the data that you use, of course, you have the company data that you are evaluating how they are implementing the controls and the size of the organization and the exposure and et cetera. But there's a lot of other data that it's external to the company. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so the power of the model is in the research that we do on a daily basis. And Mauricio, right now we have over 75,000 major intel sources that we use. Some of those intel sources are really good at informing us the cost of things. So, you know, we have intel sources that indicate what the cost of record would be related to data breaches, or how much a business interruption event would cost on a per hour basis. Or we have intel sources, in fact, they report to us in real time, that if there is a new extortion element, like we've seen an edge case on extortion due to ransomware, then that's reported to us, and then we can use that to update variables of the model. We have other intel sources that are really good about telling us about the threat landscape. And our threat landscape does get very detailed. We look at threat across 10 major 10 major attack patterns: web application attacks, point of sale intrusion, insider privilege misuse, miscellaneous, et cetera. But then further, we divide out that threat data across 21 industry verticals. And of course, things like financial services, healthcare, retail, accommodations, food services, manufacturing, mining. Those are just some of the top we're interfacing with on a regular basis, but there's one total that exists in our data set. And then we have other data sources that are really good about telling us the ability of a threat. Beyond just threat's indicative of the volume of activity that we're seeing. But we have other data sources that actually really get into the probability of a data breach and what that probability looks like for a 1,000,000 record breach compared to 1,000 record breach. We have data sources that give us the probability of DOS attacks. Are we talking about a DOS attack that's 30 minutes? And what does that probability look like as compared to the probability of a denial of 48 hours? And all of that is very informative in how we update the backend variables. As you can imagine, those variables are updated on a monthly basis. We have some that are modified even mid-month if we have an ad hoc situation, like an increase in extortion fees related to ransomware. But it is that research that we do, Mauricio, that is absolutely the heart and soul of why our model works the way that it works.
So I imagine that there's a lot of math going inside the box. Tell us about it.
So there is a lot of math. As I mentioned, you know, there's over 75,000 calculations that make it all. We do continue to find ways to improve on the mathematics and make it more efficient. In fact, we have a very lightweight version of the model that we use for small, medium-sized businesses as well as supply chain. The entire size of the application that we've built, it's a self-service application, Marisa, just to give you a context of the math, is under 6 megabytes, which is basically something you could run on a phone if you wanted to. So we're trying to do things very nimble and very fast where we can and find efficiencies as compared to how we originally wrote the calculations back in 2016. But with that being said, you know, the math isn't all X. The math is basically a lot of multiplication as we're comparing things. If you look at a normal risk formula, it times impact times and then parentheses 1 minus control effectiveness. So that sort of simplicity of math is used throughout everything that we do. Where it does become more complicated is when we build out those risk indexes and the probability. We are using some preferred calculus in those senses, but you know, we really try to keep it that our customers can work with very intuitive inputs and get very intuitive outputs, so they don't have to worry about the math that sits between the inputs and the outputs. Just like nobody thinks about the math on this web camera thing that we're using right now, or how they use their iPhone or their Droid or their PC or their MacBook. We really want to keep the math behind the scenes so that people just can work with intuitive inputs and intuitive outputs as much as possible.
Right. The magic is get something super complex and make it look super simple and intuitive. Yeah. So right. How have you validated your methodology? How some external party that has validated that this thing gives the correct numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we lucked out. We in 2016, when we were getting the company off the ground and getting our model initially filed for even a patent, our first patent application, we somehow ended up talking with AIG a lot in our development process of the model. AIG, the big insurance company. AIG was very clear to us. They were talking to about 32 major vendors in the marketplace. I'm sure you could guess who they are because we see their names everywhere in cybersecurity. Right. And they basically told us that, you know, if these 32 vendors have something better in terms of helping us put something in our underwriting platform related to understanding cyber and financial terms, then we're going to go with one of the 32 vendors. You know, you're too small, and we have to go with a name brand if an opportunity exists there, which we understood. The great news is after they met with those 32 vendors in the month of October in 2016, they called us up and they said, you know what, there wasn't a single vendor that showed us anything more insightful than what you've come up with. So we want to take your intellectual property and build it directly into our underwriting platform. So AIG became one of our first big deals right out of the gate in our first year of business. And because we are used in the underwriting context, we do have regular stress testing and validation exercises. That's part of a process in financial and insurance services called the MARS process, which is basically a model validation process that they have to go through. We do have every element of the model and the method documented. So the documentation around X analytics is about 100 pages of documentation that we have to continue to update as the model improves over time. But we do have an obligation in that relationship with AIG that our model has to perform within a plus or minus 4% margin of error. And we do have, on occasion, where they reach out and do a spontaneous stress testing or back testing or validation exercise with us. And so far, to date, we've been with them since 2016, second half of 2016. To date, we have not failed any one of those tests, and all of our results have remained within that plus or minus 4% margin of error. But that is by far the most significant validation exercise that we go through. Since then, we've done business with a number of organizations who use our modeling to deliver other services, brokering services, like on the insurance brokering side, on the consulting side. And of course, there's just constant market validation that's also going against what we do as related to the active customers that we have directly, as well as through the partnerships that we have as well.
Well, yeah, there's something that the big insurance companies know best is risk management and risk calculation. And if they bought your intellectual property, they definitely validate it and believe and make sure that it is precise. But that was my next question. How precise has it been when you do exercises? Are you way below the 4% or just missing the 4% margin? Because 4% doesn't look like magic, because we were used to get risk in colors or in qualitative, big, small, medium. And now you're telling us that you're doing it in dollars and cents and within a 4% margin. Yeah. But how precise is your model?
So typically when we get the results back, the average that we're looking at is about 2.7 to about 2.9 on the margin of error. We're not in that 4%. Now, if we were, we would take that as a sign that we need to look at some additional research. Maybe there's some bias in our data set. We need deal with the bias that might exist in our data set. But we haven't seen that yet. And again, I think it goes back to the constant research and updating of those backend variables, which is why we are staying, sort of in that high 2% side. But if we started inching into the 3s and getting closer to 4, we would start to read that as a sign that we need to look, something's off, right? And usually it's not the math that's off. Usually for us, it's going to be the backend data that we're populating is something that we need to take a look at. Now, there is the reality that we've made predictions. Like we wrote a blog after the Equifax breach occurred back in September of 2017. I indicated that would be about $1.3 billion on our. I got a lot of criticism from peers in the industry that, Bob, that's just a ridiculous number. No way damages are going to be at $1.3 billion. That's just completely ridiculous. And as went by, our number looked really off. But as we got to October of 2017, when they posted their earnings report for that quarter, and they are new SEC guidelines for a publicly traded company on cyber reporting, they indicated damages were just over $1.3 dollars at that point in time. So as time went on, our number did end up becoming realized and became true. Now, what's interesting about that is that there was no magic, Mauricio. We saw the signs in the past data set, and that's what gave us the understanding that Equifax was going to sit in that range as well. But, since Equifax has gotten some really big things as related to the breach, all 50 states as well as the Federal Trade Commission joined together to issue one big fine to Equifax. And Equifax, as we sit today, is actually hovering about 1.7 billion in total damages. So as years went by from 2017 to where we are now in 2020, when they're still paying the consequences of that data breach, we have been using their to update edge case data in our model so that as we see these new unprecedented regulatory fines or class action lawsuits, we're weaving that data in. And last year alone, in 2019, we saw unprecedented regulatory fines related to Google, for Facebook, Equifax, all of other organizations. And of course, we've taken all of that data to continue to true up the back-end variables of our model. I know that was a long-winded answer there, Teresa, but I'm sure I provided some context.
No, but it's really valuable. It's really valuable. Thank you. And yeah, that is very important because the first time we come up with these numbers, well, I'm going back a little bit. So if I run this methodology in a company and we do it correctly, say we're getting the correct data and we're inputting the correct data into the model, there is a very high precision or probability that that's the number that they should be looking at to take care and to put in their provisions for their annual loss. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. And one of the things that we saw, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
One of the things that we saw this year to that point, Mauricio, the amount of revenue that organizations generate from online sources has changed dramatically because of COVID, right? And so, we saw organizations last year that were reporting that online revenue being 16% of total revenue. When we look at those same clients today, we see that online revenue is closer to 90% of revenue. So it's dramatically. But what's fascinating is their measurement against NIST, cybersecurity framework. A lot of our customers are against NIST. They have the same tier definition. They have the same control implementation of NIST. Nothing's really changed, but their exposure profile changed. And just because their exposure profile changed, if we were looking at something just a risk score or a risk heat map, that organization would not see any change. But because we look at it from a financial standpoint, now all of a sudden a business interruption event related to a DOS attack is far more significant today than it was 12 months from today. And it's all because their exposure landscape changed, but nothing else changed. And I think the risk models miss that context, and compliance modules definitely miss that context.
Right. So we're going to do a couple of other questions, and then we'll go to see if the audience has some questions. The other thing I wanted to tell you is this is a very complex thing to do. If I am the client and I want to know my my cyber risk number, how does it look? Is it a lot of work on my side to get there?
So again, we're really focusing on frictionless solutions. For an organization, we do have solutions where in less than 3 hours, and by the way, for many organizations, they can even do the work in 30 minutes to an hour. They can put in some really basic information into a self-service app. And at the very end of that app, they can very quickly understand where they have financial exposure, what that exposure looks like on an annual basis, and specifically what their top 5 risk scenarios are and where they need to concentrate from a control perspective. So if DOS against servers and apps showed up as the #1 most risky thing, then we would have them focus specifically on things like DOS mitigation controls. If it was an error thing that showed up as the most risky thing, then we would have them focus on error-based controls, like eliminating error from the business or reducing error from the business. But that entire exercise can take about 30 minutes to an hour, and it's designed to be completely frictionless and fast and easy. And we're tending to find that executives want to see solutions that are fast and easy, as compared to very deep and long and lengthy consulting exercises that may or may not give them an answer that they can actually work from after they're done with all of that time and all of that.
So this sounds like magic, man. In a half an hour, I can have my first 5 steps and actually, I was reading one of the questions, and the question is, what are the first steps we should do for a cyber defense plan? And you just said it, you just answered it. Let's do this half an hour eval. Let's see where we're missing, where the risk is, and immediately we have a work plan, and we don't have to go very deep.
That's right.
We can, but it would be acamaracas, or what was the famous word? Yeah, keep it simple and keep it fast, because the bad guys are simple and fast, extremely fast.
Faster than most organizations. Faster. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. And what we're tending to discover too is that, especially at the executive level, they don't need things extremely detailed. They're not asking details. They want quick answers so that they can make a decision. And then specifically, if they know that they need to concentrate on protecting web applications or against DOS attack, whatever it happens to be, then they expect the people that work below them to take care of a specific tactical step happen. But all they want is, what's the answer? Where do we need to focus, and what does our problem look like? Is it a big problem? Is it a little problem? And if it is a big problem, then where can we focus? And so we have designed a very swift, frictionless way to do that. Not only, by the way, for the organization, Mauricio, but also for the supply chain members. In 30 minutes, they can actually get an understanding of supply chain represents in terms of exposure back to their organization. So if they were outsourcing stuff to AWS or Microsoft Azure or some consulting firm or transportation firm, then very quickly they can realize what that financial exposure also looks like in a 30-minute or less activity as well.
Great, thank you. So one last thing that we're going to get this question, so I'm going to ask it to you before. So sure. US companies and US checkbooks are big. Companies in our region are not as big, and more of the time they're smaller. How does your model work for regions like ours, which are the companies are smaller, the risks are a little different, because maybe we don't have so much intellectual property of some of the companies that you are working with in the US. But nevertheless, we're getting hit all the time. Does the model take that in account? Yeah.
It does, and we do it in 2 ways. ways. The first is that our backend data is divided out where the data does exist across regions and countries. In fact, you know, we can get down to the cost of things in countries like India or Japan as compared to looking at Asia Pac as an entire region, right? Because there's very big swings depending on those countries. The same in Europe, right? What something would look like in Germany or the United Kingdom is very different than what damages would look like, say, in Italy or Turkey. And then when we come to Central and South America, you know, we find the same is true there. Brazil, damages in Brazil look very different than damages as compared to, say, Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador. And so we take all of those cost components, those back-end variables, and we consider them based on the regional in-country selections that are made. But the other part of it, Mauricio, is the exposure profile of the organization. And you're absolutely right. You know, I have a customer, as I mentioned, that has 1 million records. That's a ridiculous number of records. Really having most of the world on your platform. And you know, you might have a similar type technology company, but with a much smaller customer base in Central America or South America. And if that's the case, that exposure profile that's being built out would tell us that difference, right? Instead of dealing with 1 billion records, maybe we're dealing with 1 million records or 10 million records. And that understanding alone gives us a very different context of what financial exposure looks like in terms of operating hours, give us an understanding, the value of your intellectual property, if you're using Swift or not using Swift. By the way, fun fact regarding to Swift, in Asia Pac, 100% of the financial institutions that use Swift messaging services reported in the first half of 2020 that they've had misappropriation of funds through the Swift transaction or Swift messaging platform. So that means that every single one of those financial entities has experienced some sort of fraudulent event related to wire transactions. But in Latin America, that number is not quite as high. So we use all of those details to make sure that we're true enough based on the region and based on the size of the organization that we're contending with. Did that help answer the question?
That helps very much. So, and I don't think I have any other questions. Do we have questions from the audience? No, we don't. That is extremely interesting. There is one. My eyesight is not working correctly, so they will help me. Give me half a second, please. Okay, now I can see. Yeah, this is a comment teaching massively all the users at a global level would decrease the heavy load for the experts. That would be a great alivio. Oh my, English is gone. But yeah, definitely if we could do something like it was done with polio, everybody got a shot and polio basically vanished from the face of the earth, that we're looking forward for COVID shots as well. If we could do teach everybody cyber hygiene, things would be really easy. Unfortunately, we cannot teach them even how to take care of themselves in a COVID pandemia with their face mask and with the distancing. It's going to be difficult to teach cyber hygiene to all the world. But yeah, that would be a great thing. But definitely, we have to live with what we have. And one of the things that is very important is understand where your risk is and how to mitigate it. And sometimes the acamaracos, I'm liking that word, and I'm going to use it extensively in my presentations. Acamaracos is going to tell you these things are going to break your company? Not necessarily. If we put them in the context of the size of the company, and we put them also, which are the things that are most risky for you, and how to fix them. Yeah, it's the question is, what is required from the customers to do an effective risk evaluation? What type of data should they be able to provide us?
So I think that's a bit of a question, right? Because I think it's going to depend on the type of organization that we're contending with. But more than anything, organizations need to understand their exposure profile. And what we tend to find is that a lot of organizations don't think about cyber risk in that context, and immediately they want to jump in and start answering questions related to which controls exist or don't exist. And it's that exposure file that really is the most important step. So if I were to give a step one, it would be take the time and build out that exposure profile. Of course, we make it easy because we have the input mechanism. It's a guided process so that very quickly an organization can understand what their exposure landscape looks like by answering some really basic questions. But that is a necessary first step. As a second step, I do think it's important to, look at where you have the most exposure and then tie that back to control elements that relate to that exposure. So if we're talking about things like business interruption, and it's related to denial of service events that I've mentioned several times, then something like boundary defenses in the CIS Top 20 would really be a key area to focus in on, where things like data recovery is far less important for that type of event. But if we were talking about web application attacks and web application security, then focusing in on CIS 18, which is about application security, now becomes a really critical place that you would want to take as a first step. The point that I'm trying to get to is that exposure profile should give you an indication of where you have risk and where you need to concentrate. And it's not about meeting everything in a compliance framework or control framework that exists out there. It's really about where I have risk, do I have the right things in place, or do I need to try to get some additional things in place? And then where I have very little risk, do I even need to concentrate on those sections of a framework? Do those sections even make a lot of sense for my particular organization? And that's probably the best answer that I could give, Mauricio, is that get that profile built, that exposure profile, and then from there, see how it guides you to determine what you need to measure or where you need to then measure later on in time. Any other process is really just repeating the sins of the past, right? Try to take a compliance framework. All controls mean the same thing for all organizations, and that's just not entirely a truth. And it ends up wasting a lot of money and a lot of internal cycles that are so precious as things stand today. So, what we highly suggest is do something on a more focused approach and specifically related to the type of business that you're running.
Great answer, thank you. There's another question that says, how much should I budget for a small, medium enterprise in cybersecurity?
That's sort of the same kind of answer, right? That
right.
Number is going to vary based on the exposure profile. If you're a small, medium business, and I give you an example, I'll talk about one that I just dealt with earlier this week. I was dealing with a small business, and this small business has 40,000 records, but they have a lot of value in intellectual property. And so for them, things like cyber espionage and insider and privilege misuse related to a disgruntled employee is far more significant because they don't want that intellectual property to leave their business. They're a small, medium business. They could easily get destroyed by a bigger competitor. And their success is locked in that intellectual property. They were less concerned about a data breach. I mean, yeah, data breach would be sort of problematic for them, but it's only PII records. It's not health records. It's not personal financial information. So in their particular case, focusing on things like web application attacks or credit card skimming or point of sale intrusion. It's just less significant for them based on the nature of their business. And the budget should be related to where you have risk. And the thing that I'll point out more is you should also have the ability to take the look at whatever you're spending. So if you're buying a DOS mitigation service or vulnerability scanning or a mock phishing exercise from Wombat or whoever it happens to be from, then in those cases, you want to see what is the delta on your exposure, your financial exposure with that control and without that control. And if that delta between the two is less than the cost of buying that solution, then you probably don't want to buy that solution because it's going to represent an upside down return on investment. On the other hand, if that delta is greater than the cost of that solution, now you have a very good positive return on investment. You should probably execute on that particular solution. And what I'm really trying to get, once you build out that exposure, your budget needs to be aligned to how you're addressing that exposure and whether each of those projects that you're executing on are either representing a positive return on investment or a negative return on investment. And to your bosses, to the CFO, to the CEO, to the board, that's exactly the type of stuff that they're looking for today. And if you can represent that on a silver platter, you'll get everything that you need because they'll realize that it's a positive return on investment. And that's an answer that they just don't understand, they're not getting, which is why they're hesitant to make decisions and increase budgets year over year.
Thank you. Great answer. And you answered the next question immediately, which is, can we calculate a return on investment in cybersecurity projects? And basically, you just answered it. Yeah. Run the model with, run the model without, and see what's the return, and see if it's positive. And basically, yeah, that's the way to do it. So this brings me to another thing. How do you measure the effectiveness of the CISO and his security team? How can the board know this guy is doing a great job? Is it because nothing has happened yet? Or is it, how can we measure that?
So I think there's sort of three ways to look at that question, Mauricio. One is that we can take a look at the difference between inherent risk, which is the risk of the organization without any controls, as compared to residual risk. And when we look at that from a financial standpoint, that's indicating the greatness of the CISO and all of the existing controls that exist within the organization. If that organization looked $100 million worse without controls as compared to how they currently look, that's a really nice pat on the back to the CISO for the job that he or she has done within that organization. So that's one way that we've helped them indicate a positive story about the benefits of the role. The second is, the CISO role, very much like the chief risk officer role, is also about integrity. And are they honestly reporting information to their leaders and to the necessary constituents of the business? And in that case, it's not about a pat on the back. It is, are they, as they realize information to be true, are they then sharing that information with their leaders and with their constituents so that they're just really setting an honest understanding of the organization? And that's hard to do with Act Miraculous, right? That's hard to do with indicating, we have so many abilities or we close so many tickets, because those sorts of things really don't mean anything. But on the other hand, if they were to actively report, we have a risk problem and it's in data breach, and that problem looks like a $30 million problem a year, then all of a sudden people can start to get around that problem and make a decision. So the second part of that is I really look at it as an ethical thing, right? Just being honest about the data and reporting that data out to see how people respond to it. The third is about using budget in the future in a very tactful way. And that gets into running those what-if simulations, getting that understanding of return on investment. If they can really shape all of their in-flight projects and future projects around where there's healthy return on investment, and they can show that return on investment to their leaders, then it's going to allow them to build a trust relationship so that they can also get more budget as they see it in the future. But showing that success of using the budget in a very meaningful way. It gets back to one of the first points that I mentioned in the beginning, which is helping organizations control that expense line on the quarterly reporting. If you can control that expense line, even if you can cut back a little bit, that's going to be seen as a very positive thing if it makes sense to cut back. So just in summary, Mauricio, one is looking at that delta between inherent risk and residual risk and showing all of the loss that's been reduced from the business based on all the good things that are in place. The second is just ethics, honestly reporting out information as it is and not trying to cover up any of the details. And then the third is trying to use the budget in a very tactful and smart way as related to return on investment.
Thanks. And we have one final question from our audience is more based on your experience and not as much on your model. Is the cloud and whatever, that is a very, very cloudy word. Is it a good cybersecurity option for small, medium business?
You know, what we're starting to see, and we see this through the supply chain assessments that we're executing on, is that there is a positive play about moving things into the cloud for a variety of reasons. One, there's a lot of technology costs that are just becoming too expensive to maintain within a small, medium business. And at the price points of lots of SaaS services and cloud services, it is definitely a lot for the budget, right? Getting back to the budget, it is less expensive to move things into a cloud. The other part of the cloud is that so many of the cloud providers are doing the right things from a cybersecurity perspective that you just automatically inherit those controls that exist. So, you know, if they already have their SOC 2, SOC 3, you can see those controls. If their cloud certification, you can see the controls that they have in place. And so getting that automatic injection of a better security posture just by shifting things from on-prem into the cloud does end up being a really good thing. Now, I say all of that because there are clearly caveats as well. And there are times where moving things in the cloud just won't make sense. But in order to understand that, again, it's got to get back to your exposure profile, and it's got to get back to looking at what your annual exposure looks like as related to the things that you're shifting into the cloud. You may not want to put your intellectual property in a cloud storage facility because it just might be cheap. But, you know, that's just going to have to be an intimate decision that's made based on the facts that are laid out in front of you. But for the most part, moving into the cloud does make a very smart decision, not only from a budget standpoint, but also from a security standpoint as well.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment there. We do have to understand very clearly the shared responsibility model that the different cloud players bring to the table. So if we are bringing some of our applications and data to the cloud, we must understand which part of the security is going to be responsibility of the cloud provider and which part of the responsibility for the data integrity is going to be our responsibility. Because we have seen many, many times that people think that now that I am in Office 365, they will take care of everything, and it's not happening. And then they have a very unpleasant surprise. And the contract said, we won't take care of that. That was your responsibility. So that's a thing that we must understand before we jump into the cloud, is understand exactly what things they will not do for us.
Yeah, I agree. That nuance is key. And the warranties and the indemnifications in those contracts with the suppliers, the cloud providers, is definitely something everybody should review. And then the optional settings, to your point, in Office 365 and SAP's products, there's a lot of cloud products where you have the option to set those security settings. And if you choose not to set them, then clearly you don't get the benefits of those things. I do agree. There's a lot of nuance, and that nuance does need to be reviewed and reflected upon.
Right. Okay, Bob, I think we ran out of time. I really appreciate your time. Sorry for the inconveniences in the technical, but as I was explaining to our audience, Mr. Murphy is part of our staff, and he tried to do some things to hinder our start of the presentation, but it was really, really good. Thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your time with us. And I will be seeing you, what, in a week or less? So I hope to, we'll get together soon and have a drink. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll switch to Spanish really quick. Gracias a todos. Este fue nuestro último panel. El panel era nada más de Bob y su servidor. Una serie de paneles de expositores de clase mundial que generosamente nos regalaron su tiempo, nos regalaron su experiencia, compartieron sus vivencias con nosotros. Espero que haya sido de gran utilidad para todos y definitivamente va a haber más de esto. Nos quedamos tan emocionados que ya decidimos que vamos a seguir haciendo esto para siempre o hasta que nos dé la fuerza. Así es que muchísimas gracias, que todos pasen buena noche. Nos vemos pronto. Hasta pronto.